The black water between Honshu and Kyushu tightened into the Kanmon Strait and took another name in a sailor's mouth: Shimonoseki. The tide ran like a river and the current made a deep hum along the hulls of ships that tried to slip past in darkness. Coal barges stacked 3 deep. Tankers drawn low by fuel that could no longer be spared. Kaibokan escorts with tired engines. Converted trawlers that wore rifles like borrowed coats. The inland sea waited beyond, a vast bowl ringed by Kure and Kobe and Osaka, and everything that still moved in the heart of the empire had to pass through this throat. The night smelled of coal smoke and algae and rust, and of the old oil that never quite leaves a dock. The men aboard an escort vessel named for a small river watched the dark runs and felt the map in their bones. A tight S-bend between Moji and Shimonoseki, where sandbars shifted and pilings leaned. They knew the strait by sound. They did not know what the sky had become. On the airfields of Tinian and Saipan, the 20th Air Force briefed crews until the chalk dust on the boards looked like fog. This was not another high-city burn or a long stream of B-29 Superfortress aircraft at altitude. This was low altitude and a purpose that sounded simple and felt like a blade. Operation Starvation. The title carried ice. Rehearsals had burned into muscle memory. An APQ-13 radar for coastlines and fixed points. Lauren lines set so tightly that a navigator could feel the mile marks in his sleep. Parachute mine loads secured in the bellies of B-29 Superfortress aircraft with arming wires curled like stubborn vines. Mk-25 mines for shallow lanes, slim and heavy, designed to drop clean and fall into the black at 500 feet. Mk-26 in deeper water. Pressure and magnetic and acoustic fuses layered so that a convoy commander would no longer trust even his own wake. Parachutes meant to slow the plunge and lay mines soft on the bottom so they would wait without scars that show on paint. Crews assigned to the 313th Bomb Wing traced the coast of Honshu with a finger and then tapped the narrow throat of the Kanmon Strait. The strait looked like a keyhole. The plan was to fill the keyhole with iron. He was a petty officer whose hands had been cut and healed so often that new cuts made no difference now. He stood in the bow of the escort with a line over one shoulder and a lamp under a coat to keep it from showing. Moji lights held dull behind him. The water breathed its old wide breath. His job had been taught by older men as if it were a craft: pass the tight water, keep the convoy in shape, turn by the yards, feel the set of the tide, hold the signal tight, call out the poles and stones and fish stakes and funnels that look blacker than night. His world had been the math of harbor and strait and narrow channel. He had learned sonar by a different name, by how a hull talks when it slides past a rock. He had learned that mines belonged to old wars in the Yellow Sea and in shallow harbors. He had not learned the kind that fall from 500 feet at night and lie on the bottom with fuses that sense the way a ship's heartbeat changes the water itself. Near midnight, the air above the Kanmon Strait carried a second river. The B-29 Superfortress bombers of the 313th Bomb Wing came in blacked out, heavy, trimmed to 500 feet, with parachute mines waiting in them like seeds. The pilots held their jaws tight and their hands softer on the yokes. The navigators watched, and APQ-13 scopes show headlands and lighthouses as green ghosts and marked the strait with pencil taps. The radio men rode silence as if it were a living thing that could be frightened away. Each aircraft flew a corridor taught by a line on a board, then cut a notch in that line across the water. The first B-29 rolled over the mouth of the strait and let go the first pair. Parachutes spread like pale flowers under the black. The mines fell, turned slow, then gathered speed, then met current and slid to the bottom where the tide pulled at them as it pulls at a man's shirt. Armed after a delay that no one in water could guess. Sensitive enough to notice a ship coming before a lookout would. The escort heard a sound that did not belong to anything he knew. It was the noise of air where it should not be, a kind of soft rip. Then it was gone. He looked up and saw nothing. He looked at the water and saw lines where no boat had drawn them. He felt his teeth touch in a way they had not before. He thought of a torpedo and then dismissed it, because a torpedo makes itself known with urgency, and this sound had been like a whisper behind a door. He walked his eyes along the convoy. Coal barges braced together with ropes that were no longer new. A tanker with a white band still not painted out. A promise that had been ignored. A Kaibokan running with plates hammered back into place after a winter storm. The inland sea had become a place where every hull wore its history in plain view. He put his mind back into the strait because distraction in this corner of the world kills. The mines lay in the throat and waited. Water moves with muscle in the Kanmon Strait. The tide runs hard, builds humps that boil and turn, lifts a convoy 5 meters in a short reach. The pressure under a hull changes with a force that men can feel in their knees. The new mines were born for this water. The Mk-25 on the soft bottom did not need a ship to touch it. It counted the pressure change and mixed it with the magnetic change and listened once for the ship screws, and then it made a decision. The first it chose was a coal barge riding high and light in the stern. The mine woke, and it was as if a new hill of water had been bent upward and then personified. The coal barge lifted and split, and the light on its stern turned end over end and went away. Men shouted, and then the wind pressed their voices against their teeth, so that they went back into their mouths. The strait held the cry for a second and then let it go. The 20th Air Force had drawn a map that took a river and made it into a trap. Operation Starvation was neat on the board and brutal in practice. The 313th Bomb Wing aircraft flew in pairs and threes, cutting new lines through the strait, dropping Mk-25 parachute mines into lanes that pilots had been told to measure with their eyes. This buoy to that headland. This wharf to that ferry dock. These were runs that could be read in the dark. An APQ-13 radar gave the shape of land and water. Lauren gave the position even when the clouds folded in. The B-29 Superfortress crews finished the first sweep, turned down the length of the inland sea with their bellies lighter, and the sea changed without changing. The pilots held to their airspeed, and the turbulence that comes at 500 feet above a tide rip pushed their lungs up and down. They went back to tinny and with nothing to show on their cameras except blackness and instrument dials. They trusted the mines to speak for them in the hours after. Moji woke with a new wrongness. Harbormen at dawn smelled metal and oil without ships attached. A ferry in the Kanmon Strait took its morning risk and found it magnified to something she had not done before. She rose and fell in a new way and then missed a heartbeat and then came apart. The inland fishermen stared across the narrow water and saw waves with square shoulders. The petty officer on the escort leaned into the bow and felt the current speak a second language. He had learned the names for this: pressure and wake and draft. He did not know the mine that turns those names into figures and those figures into iron. The escorts began to sweep in the spring light with tools that belonged to different wars. Paravanes went out like kites. Towed sweeps looked like old men trying to dance. The crews talked about acoustic influence and magnetic influence as if saying the words could turn them into things a man can touch. They set degaussing coils and took bearings along shore to make sure the loops worked. The petty officer watched the sweep wire rise and fall like a heart. Came up clean. It meant nothing. The Mk-25 mines waited for pressure and magnet and then for a rhythm they liked. The next convoy out of Moji caught the rhythm. A tanker lifted. A Kaibokan rolled until she could not correct. A barge folded under its own center. Operation Starvation had found the narrow place and used it. 20th Air Force crews gritted their teeth down the neck of the inland sea again. They went low in the night under the eye lines of picket boats and under the beams of spotlights that fumbled and failed to find them because the black under the belly of a B-29 at 500 feet might as well be the color of blind faith. The 313th Bomb Wing maps had grown marks. Shimonoseki Strait had been cut and recut. New mine lines laid across approaches to Kure and to Ube and to the harbors that fed the factories that still moved. Parachute mines fell and sat like a new layer of geology. The fuses counted and waited and did what they had been told by men at benches in places that smelled like solvent and chalk. Operation Starvation gained new teeth that did not need to be fed again. A Japanese minesweeper built from a trawler set out with a crew that wore the faces of men who had been brave too many times. They paid out sweep wires and dragged them across old channels that had been hammered into habit by decades. The sweepers pulled hard for moored mines that had been the old enemy with horns and floats. The new mines had no horns. They had mines. The sweepers did not find them. The escort saw the minesweeper run into an invisible threshold and saw its stern lift and then saw a sheet of brown water rise where the stern had been. He felt himself try to step backward, found a mast behind him, and could not move. He tasted iron on his tongue and knew what it meant. Operation Starvation had moved beyond a tactic. It had become a weather system in the Kanmon Strait and in the teeth of the inland sea. From the air, the B-29 superfortress crews saw only the picture on the scope and the pale far glimmer on a black river that was a ship, and then nothing. They did not have the satisfaction of seeing a blast. They trusted the idea that a mine on the bottom will make an argument the next day and the next and the next. They trusted the 20th Air Force staff who had told them that shutting the Kanmon Strait would freeze the inland sea, that Kure would choke, that Moji would watch barges gather in ridiculous herds and then scatter again when one of them was turned into spray. They trusted that the 313th bomb wing lines would work. They flew their altimeters and listened to engines work at a beat that mechanics had tuned with an old poetry. They did the work and then left the strait to its new physics. By April, the word hunger could be smelled in Shimonoseki. Men counted sacks on docks and lied to themselves and to each other about how many were full and how many were empty. The petty officer learned the shapes of rafts used for bodies. He learned to read the wake of a mine, which is to say he learned to read nothing. He discovered that he could tell when coast watchers were lying by the pitch of their voices on the set. He discovered that the Western District Fleet orders would arrive with tight language about sweeping and clearing and open channels, and that the strait would reply by maintaining its quiet promise to drown anyone who needed to be drowned that day. The inland sea did not stop moving, but it had been given weights around its ankles. A long line of coal barges waited in a crowded line west of Kobe and rocked in place like horses at a hitch rail. A tanker with gasoline for airfields inside the islands left Moji under escort by 2 Kaibokan and a trawler converted to sweep, and it hit a pressure influence mine halfway through the S-bend and turned into a ring of burning that drifted east and west with the tide and caught harbor trash and then shed it again the way a mine discards thoughts when it has too many. Men on shore lifted their eyes and then dropped them. The petty officer on the escort wrote numbers on a board that nobody looked at again. There is a stage in a long failure when numbers are insulting. The men stopped there and waited to be told to move. Operation Starvation became the subject of sentences.
À tous en sortie.
1,000 mines. More. The tonnage figures that staff love grew neat in columns. Loss rates for convoys rose in the inland sea far above the ones seen in the open water. The Kanmon Strait became a name for fear, and in port after port the harbormen made tight jokes about being able to walk across the inland sea on barge decks and bodies if it would help them move anything at all. The petty officer kept his lamp clean and his line coiled and walked his eyes along the water and looked for clues and found none that mattered. He wondered about the men who dropped the first mines. He did not hate them. He hated that they had found a way to make water into a wall. The 313th Bomb Wing aircrews returned on nights that blew rain sideways across the nose cones. They flew low across the gray heads of waves and dealt with downdrafts along the edges of islands that grabbed at wing tips. The bomb bays opened, the parachutes pulled, the Mk-25 mines dropped clean and fell. And APQ-13 painted the narrow lanes. Lauren intersections clicked from ink into a habit of the hand. Pilots trimmed pitch by 1 degree in a gust for a mine that would matter in 3 hours to a ship whose name they would never know. They went home and they slept or did not sleep. Operation Starvation did its work forever in the minutes when they were eating or shaving or lighting a cigarette that would blow out anyway because airfields are not still places. The petty officer watched a Kaibokan go down as if it had decided to kneel. He had not seen that before. A small weapon under a ship makes a ship into a lever and lifts it until it breaks. He watched soccer balls float into a corner of a wharf and wondered which ship had had them tied up on a rail, and whether a hand had reached for one when the deck went wrong. He watched heavy oil creep out of a large hole cut into the sea and then disappear, pulled under by the tide and the force of a strait that cares only about moon and wind. He watched a boy wade into the surf downstream from Moji and lift a crate and look around for someone to tell him what to do with it, and find no one. In Kure, in Kobe, at Ube and Osaka, the inland sea bound everything. The Navy counted ships safe and began to mark traffic with impossible routes that ran from point to point across a web of places where no mine had gone last week. The staff wrote the phrase Western District Fleet and sent orders that piled up in a coastal command post with a paint smell and stale smoke and the quiet of men who have begun to listen to machines more than to weather. A captain who had loved charts all his life asked for someone to tell him whether the new mines could learn a lane. An engineering officer with a face like a cracked plank said that the mines did not learn. They were placed and waited. They were turned on and they made decisions strictly as designed. It is worse than learning, he said in the calm way of a tired man, because the water changes with the tide and the ship's weights change too, and the mines do not care that we are beings. The petty officer did not hear that conversation. He felt its truth in his bones when a barge ahead of him lifted and when the current pushed the oil of it toward his face. By May, Operation Starvation closed the Kanmon Strait for stretches that felt like the end of a month. 20th Air Force reports that did not show the faces of men at all listed B-29 superfortress sorties and mine drops and navigational fixes. The 313th Bomb Wing pilots grew familiar with landmarks that in daylight tourists notice for other reasons. A light on a little jetty. A rust stripe on a cliff that shows at low water. The twisted mast of a wreck that had not been there before. Pilots trained themselves not to look right or left and not to lock memory to any image other than gauges, to any voice other than the one in the nose who said mark and mark and mark as the radar set placed another line on the map. Parachutes opened. Silk filled. Iron fell. The night caught each mine with the gentleness of a midwife and then forgot it immediately. The mines remembered for the night. They held the memory tighter than any man. The petty officer slept on a bench near a shore he had known his whole life and woke with a noise he had never heard. A hollow cough that came from under a ship and then a second cough that came from under himself, which is to say from under the land, since the sea is a skin and all the pressure this side of the world stands on it. He sat up and at the instant his spine came straight. A pressure mine took a fishing boat 40 meters from the shore and he felt it in his feet and in his stomach as if the wave had come through him instead of through the water. He stood and his mouth tasted of rust and he did not spit because in that moment a man knows not to give anything back to the air. The inland sea's choke began to change the larger war. Coal did not reach plants that made steel. Fuel did not reach the few airfields that tried to keep a sky for men to fight in. Food did not reach cities with mouths so wide that the young thought a ship was just a merchant name for hunger. The petty officer learned that a man can get used to anything so long as the day insists on it. He took his boat into the strait when the order said to and did not go when the order said not to. He began to study the tide tables as if a new religion had been printed in them. He made calculations in his head that had nothing to do with mathematics and everything to do with the oldest work a sailor has ever done, which is to predict when the water will forgive a mistake and when it will not. 20th Air Force Command sent new waves of B-29 superfortress aircraft on nights when the moon made the water look like metal. The enemy would expect comfort in these conditions. The 313th Bomb Wing chose to fly then as well because paradox is a weapon too. And an APQ-13 radar scope does not care about the phase of the moon. Lauren does not blink. Parachute is happy to open under any sky. The crews counted seconds between release and the blur of the parachute fill that they could not see. They knew the shapes of the strait even without eyes. They laid lines of mines in layers and called them field names that were codes and that eroded quickly into the simple language of men. That black point. The third pier. The shoulder of the headland that looks like a sleeping hog under certain light. Operation Starvation felt like a sentence that ended with a period, not with an exclamation, and the period is the most terrible end of all because it means a plan has been made into a machine. There were still breaks in the strangle. A convoy slipped through when the tide ran just right and when a luck that is too honest for a report put a seam in the water that carried the convoy. Someone wrote it down and then someone else said do not trust it, and everyone nodded. A minesweeper cut a moored head by accident and called it a victory. A new piece of gear credibly called an acoustic sweep was bolted to a stern and dragged and convinced men for an hour that it was an answer. The petty officer looked at the gear and saw it had been built out of the remains of other ideas and he loved it for that. It would not help. The mind that listens for propeller song would also listen for this song, and at some point, when its mind is satisfied, it would open its throat and shout water upward in a voice only the sea understands. The ports along the inland sea took to signing their risks to each other. Kobe tapped. Kure tapped. Tokuyama tapped. Osaka tapped. The messages grew shorter, then longer because everything short had already been said. Men who had once drunk together in a bar near a shipyard now traded numbers in a clipped calm that had nothing to do with friendship and everything to do with keeping their hands from shaking. 20th Air Force analysis back on Tinny and recorded an effect that glowed in its own way. Shipping movements decreased to a trickle. The Kanmon Strait, when mined, could almost stop sea traffic. Operation Starvation showed the entire inland sea as a punishment you cannot see. The 313th Bomb Wing put a pencil through its own checklist, and yet the crews knew better than to look for celebration. They slept when they could. They sat in shadow and listened when they had to. They watched ground crews load new mines into the bellies of B-29 Superfortress aircraft with the care of men putting a child to bed. They stood at the edge of runways and watched aircraft roll, and knew it was another night where something would happen that no one would witness and that many would feel. The petty officer walked the wharf at Moji and read names on sterns that had been painted and repainted until the letters slid toward nonsense. He watched a man drop a rope and not bend to pick it up. He tasted a rain that had more smoke in it than water. He heard the word Shimonoseki whispered by a woman as if it were a person. He learned to carry 2 pieces of cloth, one clean and one dirty, and to put the clean one over his mouth when the wind blew from the strait and the dirty one under it when men looked at him and expected him to stand upright. He waited for orders, and the orders came as if they had been written by new hands struggling to grasp the facts. He went to sea when they told him. He kept a prayer that did not have a God in it. On a last vast run, as the spring turned toward summer and the map on the 20th Air Force wall gained an outline like an iron fence around the inner sea, the 313th Bomb Wing sent a line of B-29 Superfortress aircraft slicing from one cape to another. The altimeters stayed fixed, and APQ-13 gave the coast as certain shapes at certain sweeps. The navigators tapped mark at the Kanmon Strait, and the pins in the board slid to a number that meant that even ships named in a captain's marriage vow would now be held in place or busted loose. Operation Starvation had reached the quiet satisfaction that numbers give officers and the dark suspicion that wakes men in the night. It had worked more fully than anyone will ever look at comfortably. After that, hunger entered the sentences openly. Inland sea cities began to flatten their shoulders under the weight of it. The petty officer found that he could tell whether a man had eaten by the sound of his feet on a ladder. The Kanmon Strait did not need to be hit nightly anymore. It only needed to hold what it had. The mines, patient as stones, waited. Those who could waited too. Those who could not moved because the orders said move. A Kaibokan crew ran the gauntlet at a slack tide and lived, and the petty officer watched from a wharf and did not clap. The very next hour a barge of timber rolled as if a sleeper had turned in his bed and never righted. He watched the beams float out and bump the pier and push a boy into deeper water than his short legs could handle. He did not move because another man did, and because his mind now drew lines on the water where none existed. The long chain of the war ran on beyond the inland sea. Guam and Saipan had other uses. Okinawa became a word that changed the air even when spoken alone. The petty officer would end the war with the sort of relief that has bruises in it. He would stand on a pier that looked inward to a sea he had once considered predictable and feel no predictions left in him. He would hear 20th Air Force as a set of syllables that could not be seen and that did not need to be seen. He would hear Operation Starvation and wonder who had chosen the title, for it was too plain and too exact by half. He would hear B-29 Superfortress and imagine a shape that had once only carried fire and now had carried sobriety in the form of mines. He would hear 313th Bomb Wing and have no faces to go with it and not care. The work had been done without him. The work had included him anyway. In another corner of the world, men would tell other stories to explain how nights are measured. They would say that some divisions learned to hold a line with stubbornness in frozen forests and some armored divisions learned to break with speed or die. They would say that Highlanders had their own hard maps near Cannes, and Panzer divisions learned again what happens when mobility turns to mud and walls of iron wait for them at crossroads. Those sentences would carry their own truth and would find their own books. The petty officer would not hear them then. He would be too busy counting the steps on a narrow pier and the spaces between piles where children fish for words. And yet, somewhere in the long record of this century, the names will gather in one room, even if the seas that held them never met, and a man will understand that Shimonoseki and Ken are not enemies but twins in a ledger where steel is taught the same lesson over and over with different hands. Somewhere, a boy will ask him what mines sound like and he will say nothing. Then he will touch the pier with his foot and make a tapping that suggests depth. Then he will stop because it is unnecessary. The sea gives the answer without being asked. It holds silence as a way to instruct. The boy will follow a gull with his eyes. The man will follow a net with his. The wind will bring a smell of algae and rust and old oil and something else that a man used to call war and now calls something he cannot name. There are lines of iron still in the mud under the Kanmon Strait. They lie patient and blind and dead now, and they will be found by accident and explained in museums to boys who will touch glass and wonder why such thin parachutes hung from such heavy things. The 20th Air Force crews who flew the last runs will age and tell their own plane story with the calm of men who did a job no one could see and that everyone felt. Operation Starvation will live as a title in long books and as a short phrase on the tongues of those who study gears rather than faces. The 313th Bomb Wing will be a patch on a jacket still worn out to a breakfast place by a steely man in a cap. A petty officer will stand on a wharf at Moji and watch a tide turn, and he will forgive the water over and over because there is no other way to be a man in a place like this. The inland sea will forget on the surface and remember beneath. It will return to carrying slow coasters and ferries that smell of cabbage and diesel. It will make a water skin over cities that learn to be old too quickly. The Kanmon Strait will continue to race the moon. Shimonoseki will sell fish on streets that shine in the rain. Moji will mind its rails and its ropes. Kure will live with its own silences. Kobe will practice a harbor's art of turning ships into points and points into ships. And around a corner, just under the elbow of this land, something will wait in the mud and no one will have to be told that it was once a machine that taught men a small piece of what timing means. For those who care about the long shapes of history, the lesson will stand without formal announcement. It will say that the soft drop of iron guided by careful radios and patient radar and still hands can change the course of months as cleanly as a loud raid, that a strait given a new meaning will suffocate a sea, that a crew coming home without having seen a single flame can carry a heavier burden than a crew that flew through hellfire and counted its own limbs afterward. For those who prefer numbers, the columns will continue to look simple and accurate.
Sortie.
Mines. Ships stopped. Tonnage lost. Supply line collapse. For those who prefer the human, the edges are harder, and the ledger is full of small unclaimed entries like a boy with a crate on a wharf or a petty officer's tongue tasting iron when the mine under the fishing boat coughed. Shimonoseki is a mouth. It is the mouth of a sea and it is the mouth of a memory that speaks only in brevity. Even when it says nothing it takes something from you, and the only trade a man has is work and the promise to keep his hands honest in a place that will punish a lie. The Kanmon Strait draws the breath of two islands and makes a song that is older than any navy. The parachute mines slowed the song and changed its phrases and then left again when time had finished with them. The best a man can do when he was part of this is to hold three words in order and not let them be moved by the next wind. 20th Air Force. Operation Starvation. Shimonoseki. The wider war grows its own branches even when a story narrows into a strait. Other places hold other names and they ask to be remembered without envy. Stories in the Ardennes hold their snow heavy and their armor grim. Stories can write Highland hymns in mortar dust. Stories about panzer divisions try to make logic of break and encirclement and collapse. Those other branches can be found and followed in places where books and film hold their line, from on one shelf to on another, from in a quiet room to or where other battles hold their light. Here, in this water, the lesson stayed simple. A narrow place can be taught a new meaning, and when it learns it, everything behind it changes.